Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, we can move it.
On this thing.
Yeah, that is what I was saying. The bottom left corner, you have these icons.
Low back pain is one of the most commonest problems with the general practitioner sees. And in orthopedic practice, this is the fifth most common symptoms. It affects people of all age group. And 80% of the population suffers from low back pain once in their lifetime. Why it is important is because of the fact that degenerative disc disease, disc prolapse, listhesis, infection, and even tumors, all of them present as low back pain. And they all similarly present as low back pain in majority of the scenarios. What we know about low back pain is it's a symptom, it's not a disease. The causes could be intraspinal and extraspinal causes. The spinal causes of back pain, as you all know, is degenerative, inflammatory, infection, trauma, metabolic, and neoplasm. Whereas the non-spinal causes also are important. It can come from the abdominal viscera, it could be from the vasculature, or it could be psychogenic. I'll just show an example of a patient who had underwent a L4-5 discectomy. His symptoms persisted. And if you see his repeat MRI scan, there is a presence of a disc. And he was advised a fusion elsewhere. But if you look at the MRI carefully on the anterior aspect, there's a presence of a huge aneurysm of the aorta. And this was the one which was causing him back pain. Therefore, it's important for us to know what are all the factors that causes back pain. What we know, non-specific low back pain is the most common. The first episode, 95% recover and stay pain-free. And the recurrence depends, it's basically common on patients who had a initially very high pain. And those patients who takes a long duration for the first pain to subside, who has repeated episodes, greater than 2 or 3 episodes of back pain, then the recurrence chances are much higher. Therefore, it's important to have a systematic approach. That means history, physical examination, investigation, and treatment. What is low back pain? It's basically the pain between the lowest rib and the crease of the buttock. And sciatica is a back-related leg pain. That means a patient with low back pain can have just a back pain alone, or he can have an associated radiculopathy or a sciatica. That means a pain which moves around down to the leg. Low back pain can be defined as acute, subacute, or chronic based upon the duration. If you read the literature, some people say acute up to 4 weeks, but overall, to be simplifying, it is less than 6 weeks. Subacute is 6 to 12 weeks. Chronic is greater than 12 weeks time. And now to discuss, we have a 35-year-old patient, acute low back pain on lifting bucket for 5 days duration. He's got limitation of ADL, walks with a stiff back, SLR is negative and neurology is normal. Ranjit, what about getting X-rays and when to get MRI in these particular scenarios?
In these patients where it is very typical for the classical low back pain, young male patient, history of a strenuous activity like lifting weight, 5 days of pain, no history of trauma, fever, I will not get an MRI or even an X-ray. First episode of back pain with no leg pain does not need investigation.
Okay, usually when the patient comes, it's not necessary to get an X-ray or even an MRI when he has a very short duration. But what if he insists that I would like to get an X-ray or MRI done?
So we can get an X-ray or MRI done, or rather an X-ray done, telling them that I'm not suspecting any structural problem, but we can expect at times surprises, but it necessarily might not change my management plan. So if the patient insists, I'll always get it done, because there is more to back pain than diagnosis. It's also mental satisfaction. So I can get it done, but I'll tell him that this might not, with a 5 days history, no trauma, no fever, no fall, I might not change my management. Yeah. MRI, I will strictly not encourage with no leg pain and no red flags.
Usually you mean to say that you can treat them conservatively and see the response. If that doesn't become better, then you can think of getting an X-ray done and later on an MRI if the symptoms persist for more than 2 or 3 weeks time, right?
Yes.
Okay. But this patient, for some reason, he came to us with the MRI scan. And he already had got an MRI done elsewhere, which is quite a common practice. And Thomas, this is what the imaging shows.
So irrespective of what the imaging shows, I think it's important to explain to the patient what the problem is. So we need to explain to them very clearly that the natural history of acute low back pain. We know that the majority of them do settle down, and majority of them do settle down with or without treatment. So what I would normally advise is some NSAIDs and physiotherapy. So I send most of my patients down to the physiotherapist. I give them some NSAIDs. I tell them I rarely advise bed rest for any of them. So I tell them that they can do whatever is possible for them to do within the limits of their pain. If the pain is too much, well, they can lie down in bed. Regarding going back to work, I leave it to the patients. I tell them that if you feel that you can manage a full day in office at work, you can go ahead. If the pain is too much, well, you can stay at home. I leave it to them. Rarely advise complete bed rest for anybody. So it's my first line of treatment would be NSAIDs and physio.
What about muscle relaxants?
I rarely give muscle relaxants, sir. I normally give. I rarely use combination medications anyway. So most of my patients get plain single NSAIDs.
Surya Prakash, do you advise any LS belt, traction, wax bath? Because this is one of the commonest things patients are used to.
Many times when the people present to us with these X-rays and MRIs, one of the biggest problems I find is counseling the patient not to take the MRI report seriously. The problem is the radiologist, whoever has reported the MRI, would have written there is some bulge, degeneration, the mild disc herniation, and these chaps would have done so much of internet research on those items, so much of internet research that it becomes, they are sort of convinced that they are suffering from some serious problem. So basically, I think it takes a lot of time first to convince them that these are natural ways how the back would behave with age, how some amount of degeneration is present. Now, as far as the lumbosacral bend and traction though I never insist, nor I never suggest. Lumbosacral belt, I just tell them that if it gives them psychological support, they can as well use it. But there is no hard and fast rule that they have to use the LS belt. And I personally also don't prescribe lumbosacral belt for any patients other than people who really want to use it belt, or they're sort of sold out to the idea of using the belt. So generally from my side, there is no prescription for lumbosacral belt or any orthosis for such a situation.
Yeah, basically we can summarize that LS belt is not advocated, but however, if the patient feels that he is comfortable, is already using it, advise him to use it for a few days and then
slowly get out of the belt.
Do you use muscle relaxants in your practice?
I do use on and off, but not really as a sort of a strong prescription. Exactly what helps these patients, it's very difficult to ascertain. Sometimes it could be counseling which has helped the patient. Sometimes maybe the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs which have helped the patient. So it's just that once in a while, if they are not happy with NSAIDs, I add another muscle relaxant to the prescription. But per se, my mainstay would be to explain them and give them simple analgesics like a paracetamol or a ibuprofen or something like that.
Okay. As per the guidelines, I mean, there is no insufficient evidence to support LS belt, traction, even other medications. Once the pain becomes better, aerobic exercises is recommended. I mean, as Thomas put it forward, physiotherapy and good form of exercises is very, very essential in these patients. Coming to acute low back pain, as discussed already, the cause is
There's a question from the delegates. There's a question from the viewers, sir.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Take now.
We'll take it now itself. Naresh?
Question. Yeah. This is induced low back pain.
What, Naresh? I'm not able to.
Not clear, Naresh.
Question from Radha Krishna. He wants to know whether you use LS belt for lesthesis induced low back pain.
Thomas?
I rarely use LS. I don't, at least I don't insist on patients to use LS corsets at all. Like Dr. Surya Prakash said, if some of them are really, give them a lot of moral support, if at all. So I let them use it if they're already using it, but I don't really insist on anybody using a LS corset for any of the low back pains.
To summarize, basically in a chronic condition of low back pain, what is essential is to increase the strength of the core muscles of the abdomen and core muscles of the spine. And in case using belt for a long duration actually works against that principle, and actually rather than strengthening the muscles, you're tending to make them much more atrophic. Therefore, in a chronic low back pain, in acute exacerbations, you can use it for a short time, but in a long-standing situation, it's not advocated to continue using LS belt.
Yes, we'll go.
But having said that, Ajay, there is another interesting part, because see, I had an episode of back pain, and for me personally also, for initially when the pain was very severe, I thought maybe wearing a belt helped me, but then it's just very transient. I'm sure a lot of patients will be feeling the same way. Just use a belt for a day or two. It's not a bad thing, but then the problem is it becomes something like how they wear a necklace in the in the neck. Belt is worn loosely around the body, and they feel very happy about it.
I agree. As many discussed, acute low back pain, usually 90% of the patients become better in a very short duration of time, with or without medication. I mean, you can give NSAIDs definitely because they have to tide over the acute pain. Don't advocate a lot of rest. The maximum rest that is advocated is a day or two. After that, it's better to get back to activity. And we have found that people who are active, getting back to work, are more likely to become better and stay better, rather than people who tend to take rest for a longer duration of time. Like people come and say, I've been in bed rest for 1 month. They tend to recover very poorly. Whereas chronic low back pain is another thing, and greater than 3 months. Therefore, there's acute and chronic symptoms could be there. There could be psychological factors are involved. You can define chronic low back pain into a chronic axial low back pain, which just goes up to the buttock, chronic axial low back pain with radiation, which can go up to the knee joint, or a low back pain with a radicular component. That means the pain radiates below the knee joint. It's important to differentiate between referred pain and radicular pain. Referred pain basically you get from the disc, facet, and the SI joint, which is discrete, poorly localized up to the buttock and the thigh, and worsen throughout the day. Most importantly, any maneuver which increases the intrathecal pressure, like cough, sneeze, does not have effect. Whereas a radicular pain, the source is usually the nerve root or the dorsal root. It's a shooting type of pain, goes below the knee, and anything like coughing and sneezing increases the symptoms. History taking is very, very important. I mean, a lot of us don't spend time, but when you start speaking to the patient, looking at the patient, history taking is very important to come to a diagnosis, to exclude serious causes of back pain, and to rule out neurological problem. As you know, the pain is the most commonest symptoms, and it's important to find out whether pain is localized to the back or the leg, or is it a part of a generalized pain. That's also very, very common in certain people, and that indicates it could be osteoporosis or some sort of seronegative arthropathy. Guys, we have a patient here with a 65-year-old patient who had a chronic low back pain, which has worsened for 4 weeks' time. No radiation. It increases on activity. It feels slightly better at rest. He's got a night pain. He's a chronic smoker and diabetic. On examination, there is some limitation of the range of movement, but the neurology is normal. Therefore, what do you think in this scenario? What is worrying? Is this a natural scenario of presentation, or is there anything that is worrying in this particular group of patient, in the particular patient? Ranjit.
Yes, sir. So this particular patient, it has got all the red flags for me to think. Number one, he's elderly. He has got chronic back pain, which is worsened over 4 weeks, 4 weeks duration, and it is better as rest and increase on activity. That tells me that there is some mechanical component to the back pain. He's a smoker. The moment when I hear smoker, I think about vascular compromise, but he's not telling leg pain. He's also a diabetic. So diabetic, I'm all primarily thinking about neuropathy, diabetic angiopathy, vasculopathy, neuropathy, all these target organ damages. So this smoker and diabetic becomes important to me if he tells leg pain. But he's very clear, he's only has back pain and it is a chronic for a very long time. He's got significant movement restriction, but neurology is normal. So this primarily is a patient for whom I would ask for an X-ray on my first visit. First visit, I would ask for an X-ray because he's elderly. He has got long time back pain which suddenly worsened. Most likely, it might be a degenerative back pain which is suddenly having exacerbation. But having this symptom, I will ask for an X-ray, and I will also have a very low threshold in asking for an MRI. I will not wait all the way long enough to have an MRI. So definitely, this got all the red flags for me: elderly, diabetic, smoker. So I would ask for an X-ray and even an MRI early.
Yeah, it's important to identify the red flags. Red flags could be, I mean, basically, if there is no red flag, you can still go ahead with conservative treatment. But if there is a red flag and you first see the patient, it's better to move into other investigations like radiographs or, if necessary, an MRI scan. It could be determinants like elderly patient, diabetes mellitus, immunosuppression, previous history of malignancies, or it could be clinical features like unexplained weight loss, neurological weakness, history of trauma, fever, most importantly, rest pain. We know that rest pain, usually when it's present in the rest, it could be because of infection or malignancies. Classically, what is described as red flags is spinal pain, fever, and neurological dysfunction, but it's not necessary to have the classical clinical triad. But patients with the historical features of elderly, extremes of age, even in the small children, previous history of malignancies, immunosuppression, patients who are on DMARDs, you have to be extremely careful and you may have to move for. See, in this particular patient, if you see the X-ray was not that remarkable, but his MRI shows multiple metastases, including liver and omental lesions. Therefore, it's important in younger age group, it could be infection and tumor. In young and middle-aged, it could be trauma, infection, and inflammatory. And elderly, it could be osteoporosis, tumor, and infections. Therefore, it's important to understand what is red flags and when you definitely you need to get an MRI scan done. Thomas, what is your experience with yellow flags in Indian scenario? You have lived in Australia for quite a long time. And what about your experience with yellow flags and what it means? Thomas?
Tublet where, idiot.
Surya Prakash, if you are there, you can speak.
Yeah. See, I think these are actually fairly common because they have a lot of psychological feelings with relating to the back, and they really make a very a prominent part of their symptom and their personality as such. So these are really important, and the presence of yellow flags, actually we should be very careful in these patients. We should not advise them surgery even if they have got any structural or any serious problem. We have to ascertain all the issues, clearly counsel them before we make any decisions on this particular situation.
What are the yellow flags you look at when you are speaking to the patient? What are the yellow flags you are looking at? What makes you suspicious that symptoms are very generalized or non-specific?
No, in fact, these chaps keep coming up with so much of expression and so much of sort of description about their symptoms, and they say something like, see, the pain has been so difficult that I am not able to do any activity, whatever I cannot do.
Very important.
They cannot just get up from the bed. I'm not able to do anything. But then if you see them,
I'm not able to do anything.
Yeah, and if you see them, they would have spent at least an hour in front of the mirror dressing themselves up before coming to your clinic. But then they say that they can't do anything. I mean, you can really see the dissociation of their, their symptoms from their complaints.
What they complain about. And it's also important to see the patient as the patient is walking into the room, because they think that you're not observing them. And that time they're actually walking quite comfortably. And the moment you start asking the history, the symptoms are much more than what they are suffering from.
Sometimes they keep saying that the entire leg is having pain. They sort of saying that only the left side of the face, the left hand, left shoulder, left side of the trunk, left leg, entire thing pain, something like a hemiplegic sort of a symptom. And we know it is not really that easy to have some sort of a syndrome like that.
Yes. What is the importance, Thomas, you're back?
Yes, I am back.
Yeah. What is the importance of age of the patient? Like, no, you have got a 30-year-old patient with low back pain. Does he vary from somebody who is 60 years of age? If when the 30-year-old patient comes with low back pain with no radiculopathy, what is your differential diagnosis that comes to your mind?
So the cause of the pain could be different in these different age groups. So in the younger ones, it's usually short duration pain, but a lot of the younger ones come with a lot of the yellow flags. So that is something that we need to be careful of. And in Bangalore, especially, we have a lot. Amongst the IT population, work stress seems to be a big issue, and a lot of them come with back pain, which may be just anxiety and stress induced because of long working hours, and they're in a new environment, they're in a new city, and all those kind of things. In older so that's in
the younger age group. Like, no, we can have, I mean, most commonly non-specific pain. They could be yellow flags. They could be mechanical, discouragement, inflammatory. Do you see inflammatory back pain in your practice?
We see a lot of inflammatory back. Yeah, we see a lot of inflammatory back pains in our practice. Recently, we did a study. We looked at 200 MRIs. We looked at the MRI scans of 200 patients presenting to our OPD with low back pain. We found an incidence of unilateral or bilateral sacroiliitis of up to the rate of 15%. So the history is very, very important for these patients. So you need to ask them very clearly, when do they get the pain? Is it more at night? Is it more when they wake up in the morning? Or is it more with activity? If it is activity related pain, it is more likely to be mechanical. If it is pain at rest, so pain when they wake up in the morning, or pain when they are at rest, even sleeping in the afternoon can cause pain. And then they feel better with activity. That is very typical of inflammatory back pain. And these patients need actually to be sent off to the rheumatologist. So we work very closely with the rheumatologist on these patients.
Are all of them HLA-B27 positive?
Not all of them are HLA-B27 positive, but they come under this big group of inflammatory spondyloarthropathy.
Okay, good. Therefore, it's important. The age is very important. When you look at a 30-year-old patient, we have to look at whether it is mechanical, that is, rest is not there. With activity, the pain comes and decreases with rest. Or it could be discogenic low back pain, where sitting actually might increase the pain. So they are slightly better off when they are walking, and coughing and sneezing can increase the pain. As Thomas mentioned, inflammatory low back pain, like any seronegative arthropathy, like ankylosing spondylitis, 20 to 40 years of age, classical early morning pain and stiffness, decreases with activity, and gluteal pain also may be present. This is very, very important. Ranjit, if a 55-year-old patient comes with low back pain, what are the things that comes to your mind?
It depends, is it acute or chronic?
I'm speaking of chronic low back pain.
A 55-year-old chronic low back pain, the first differential in my mind is lumbar degenerative disc disease. My first differential. Depending upon the chronicity and the presence or absence of leg pain, or presence of absence of inciting factors like yellow or red flags, I will think in terms of stenosis, claudication, stenosis, vascular injury, vascular episode, instability, based on those features, sir.
How do you diagnose instability? Because it's one of the commonest thing, which is clinically, if you diagnose instability and radiologically you prove it, probably these are the patients definitely will end up having a surgery.
Surgery done. Sir, I have, there are two very, very important features when we tell about this instability. Number one, this instability, every instability does not mean that needs surgical management. The first most important point in instability diagnosis is clinical. Patient gets pain on loading the spine, like sir said now, on sitting, bending forward, lifting weight, no pain on lying down. That's one feature, that you get pain on loading the spine. Whereas if you get pain on lying down at rest, turning in bed, we should think of other cause of instability, because instability does not mean it is just degeneration. It can be because of infection, it can be because of trauma, it can be because of tumor. All the things can cause instability. But the chronicity of a back pain and instability, we think in terms of degenerative instability.
Yes.
These are the patients whom we think of investigating with a dynamic X-ray or an MRI. And based on that, all instability does not need surgery. Only say 20% of them would need surgery. And most of them, the so-called clinical instability can be treated with proper targeted physical therapy and not surgery.
Good. Therefore, instability type pain, there is also one element of degenerative instability, wherein when they get up in the morning, they say they find it very difficult to get up from bed. This is not like an inflammatory back pain. Inflammatory back pain, they get up in the morning, the back is stiff, but they're still able to get up. When there is a degenerative instability, which is very significant, when they sleep, the muscles relax. And therefore, when they get up in the morning, there is no shielding of the spine, and they find it very difficult to get up, turning in the bed. And this is one thing you have to be careful about. The other important thing, as Ranjit mentioned, you have to be careful about neurogenic claudication. That means when they walk for some distance, the leg becomes numb because of the vascular compression in the spinal cord. And this causes a significant symptoms. And actually, when they walk into your OPD, they are elderly patient, they walk with the stoop posture, because in a extension, the spinal canal dimensions is less, whereas in flexion, it's more. Then coming to you have to differentiate that from a radicular pain. Radicular pain is basically a sciatica, which is basically because of a compression of a nerve or a dorsal root ganglion. We have one more case scenario, a 35-year-old patient who presents only with left radiculopathy. SLR is positive on the left at 40 degrees and 2 weeks of symptoms. Naresh, what will he do? He has come with this MRI. He's got a L4-5 left-sided disc.
Sir.
2 weeks symptoms. He has come already with the MRI scan. SLR is positive on the left side. Neurology is normal.
So this is the classical. There is a clinico-radiological correlation. Patient has got pain, radiating. So first thing, we are sure about the diagnosis. So once we are sure about the diagnosis that this is causing the pain, so how to treat the pain is the second question. Many times I try to deal these patients with initially with analgesics and add some steroids, because there was a 2 weeks duration.
What is the steroid protocol?
Yeah, my medical management is first, and then I'll go with oral steroids along with the tablets. Then there is nothing responding, I try to give a root block depending on the pain severity at that point.
But
after 2 weeks.
Do you use gabapentinoids like gabapentin, pregabalin, antidepressants? Because nowadays, a lot of them is there in the market, and everybody tends to be using quite a lot of them. What is your recommendation on that?
I tend to use pregabalin mostly, because that reduces the analgesic requirement, along with some steroids and painkillers and NSAIDs.
Surya Prakash, you agree on this line of management at 2 weeks' time?
But medical management, gabapentin, pregabalin, antidepressants, I'm perfectly okay. But I am not a very strong supporter of giving oral or intravenous steroids. Okay. I personally feel if at all you need to give a steroid, I don't think we should put the patient on systemic risk by giving systemic steroids. If at all, you can give a root block or a transforaminal epidural steroid, very little dose and very effective outcome. And as far as traction is concerned, we all know traction only sort of puts the patient into the bed. And now that we have enough studies to prove traction is of no use.
Okay, Ranjit, at 3 weeks, he comes, no relief. What will he do? You give no root block or do surgery?
Sir, before I answer the question, regarding this muscle relaxant.
Yeah.
Muscle spasm is a protective phenomenon for the low back pain. It is kind of splinting the back. So if we treat this with an anti-spasmodic, we are taking away a protective mechanism. It will actually worsen the pain. So in acute pain, actually, we should not take away the spasm. It is helping us. It is splinting the back. Number one. Number two, sir, in this, looking at this natural history, young male, 2 weeks of symptoms, MRI showing a soft kind of disc, no bony component. there are very, very good chances that he is going to get better without surgery. But if you see very carefully, there is one speckle of calcification in that X-ray in the foramen region, which tells me that this might have been there for a long time, but I will go by the symptoms. That's only 2 weeks. So I will tell him that there is a 70 to 80% chance that you will get better by 3 to 6 weeks of time by whatever you do. You treat or don't treat. I will, sir, I personally...
You're giving him medication. He comes back after another 2 or 3 weeks. I got no relief. What will he do?
So this 3 weeks time, sir, I personally use steroids. I use steroids. I would give him, I first give oral steroids. If that doesn't work, I will try to buy time up to 6 weeks, sir. Then if the oral doesn't work or gives only transient, I'll still give like Dr. Naresh suggested, I'll give a root block. Image guided
that is a very important question, because if you see, you are capable of giving a root block, therefore you are giving a root block. But a lot of general orthopedic surgeons may not have experience in doing that, therefore they refer for epidural steroid.
Yes.
Therefore, what do you think is better? A root block is better and epidural steroid is better?
Sir,
what is the difference?
Sir, the entire principle is that we are trying to treat the chemical radiculitis which is causing the pain. We have to decrease inflammation at the site of compression. The most important anti-inflammatory is a steroid. We all know that. I give orally, it is not working. Best is to deposit locally. If there is a facility to give transforaminal epidural steroid or root block, I would have that the first choice. If that is not possible, then an epidural steroid, which is not image guided. If possible, definitely a selective nerve root block, which is image guided, is the best, because you can target the source of pain and you are very sure that you have deposited all the drug at the site of inflammation. If that is not possible, we can give epidural steroid.
Like, no, if I do not have the expertise to give a nerve root block, is epidural steroid a viable option?
There's absolutely no harm in giving it, sir, because I know that it might get better by 6 weeks. In this patient, I'm a bit cautious because I see the speckle of calcification on the lateral X-ray. So I think it might be a hard decision.
Caudal, okay, caudal epidural, because it's technically easy to learn.
Yes, sir, caudal epidural or interlaminar epidural, ultimately the drug has to reach the site of action. Both work the same.
Thomas, what's your take on...
Okay.
See, I know that selective nerve root block is the best, but in case if I do not have the expertise to do it, if I'm going to give epidural steroid, intralaminar is better or caudal epidural is better?
So before I answer your question, can I just get back into that symptoms? So a lot of patients come and tell us they've got back pain and leg pain. But I think it is very important to ask them exactly where the leg pain is. Because as far as the patient is concerned, buttock pain, back of thigh pain, and everything is leg pain, and that should not be confused with radiculopathy.
Okay.
So you have to ask them very clearly, because if the pain is radicular, it should be in the dermatome of the affected nerve.
Yes.
If it is not in the dermatome of the affected nerve, I don't think it cannot be considered a radicular pain.
Yes.
It may be just facetogenic pain, referred pain from the sacroiliac joint. So I think that's a very important thing. Number two is, when patients come and tell us they've got back pain, in all our, at least in Kannada and I'm sure in Tamil also, they use different words for back. They say Muduvali, Idupuvali. In Kannada they say Bennovu, Sontenovu. They mean different things. And we may just consider, for us, as spine surgeons, we think, that must be low back pain. So I think it is very important to ask them to point out exactly where the pain is in the back. And I also get them to point out with the finger exactly where the pain is in the leg. And unless it is in the dermatome of the affected nerve, it cannot be considered a radicular pain. That's number one, sir. Number two, regarding steroids, I offer steroids at the first visit itself. For all patients, after if they get an MRI, they come back. So they have radicular pain and the MRI correlates with the pain. I give them a nerve root block in the first instance. And the reason for this is this. So we've looked at our results of nerve root block, and we looked at the VAS scores before the nerve root block and at serial intervals after. So we've looked at VAS scores before, we've looked at VAS scores at 30 minutes after the injection, 7 days, 3 weeks, and 3 months. We found an 80% reduction in the VAS score in 30 minutes. So I think it is useful, and beneficial to the patient if you can remove 80% of their pain with one single injection. And when we looked at the 3-month follow-up, 80% of them did not require surgery. And that is the natural history of lumbar radiculopathy. We know that 80% of them don't require surgery. But if you can reduce their pain within 5 minutes, instead of waiting for 3 or 4 weeks for the pain to reduce, I think it's a great benefit to the patient.
Okay.
So that's my thinking on it.
Yes, Naresh.
Few questions from the viewers regarding the steroids. If you are using oral steroid, which oral steroid you use and specific duration? If you are using intra root block, which steroid you prefer for transforamular or epidural?
Yes.
Can I answer that?
Naresh, you said you give steroids, right? Oral.
Yeah.
Before it's
I give steroids, but my preferred oral steroid is Defloco.
6 milligrams. How often do you give it?
Very severe. So twice a day.
Are you asking me?
No, Naresh is trying to answer this voice problem, Naresh. Is 6 milligrams BD for 5 to 7 days. Then you do taper it out.
Naresh's voice is not clear. Sir, can you hear us?
No. No, but I will tell. It's basically 6 milligrams BD of Dafcot. It's used for around 5 days. And then if necessary, you can taper it to 1 OD for the next 5 days and stop. When you're giving no root block, the steroid that is preferred is
Kinocort.
Yes, Kinocort or Triamcinolone.
Triamcinolone.
But regarding epidural steroids, we need to remember that all of them are actually not recommended for epidural use. So the only one that is recommended for epidural use is preservative-free steroid.
But it's not
preservative-free steroid, which is not available in our country.
But fortunately, with Triamcinolone, they do not mention in their leaflet not to be given epidural, whereas in Depometrol, it's mentioned in the leaflet.
Not to be given.
Yeah, therefore, it's safer if you want to use Triamcinolone. It's always safer. 2 ml, that is 80 milligrams, is what would be ideal.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, we'll move on to the next one. The predictors of poor outcome with a no root block is basically we have found patients with significant sensory symptoms who had a significant ODI scores at 3 weeks. And most importantly, what we found was the lumbosacral transition segment. We found the transition segment patients who has got a transitional vertebra and at a L4-5 disc they do not do that well with no root block. They do not do that well with discectomy also. These are the patients you have to be careful. You may have to offer fusion sometimes primarily. Coming to the natural history, as mentioned earlier, whether you operate or not, the working stages is same at 4 years. And as you can see, this is a picture which shows the complete resorption of the disc at 1 year. And studies, and it's basically because it's an inflammatory response, the disc tends to get resorbed. And a meta-analysis has shown that 66% of the patient can be treated conservatively. And if you get an MRI done, it shows resorption. The disc that is worse when you look at that extruded, sequestrated disc are the one which tends to resorb much earlier. Coming to physiotherapy, like in this situation, what is the aim of the physiotherapy? Thomas is a physiotherapy person.
Yeah, no, I send a lot of my patients for physiotherapy, sir. So one thing is very clear from the evidence we have, there is hardly any role for electrotherapy. So TENS, IFT, shortwave, and all those magical things, I don't think there is any evidence for, and most of physiotherapists itself have moved away from it. So what I can tell you what we do, so we send up, I don't tell the physiotherapists what to do. So I work with a good group of physiotherapists and they take a call on what kind of physiotherapy the patient needs, because we work on the belief that they know more physiotherapy than we do. We are surgeons. And clearly they've done a master's degree in physiotherapy. Clearly they know more physiotherapy than we do. So
yeah, basically you have to strengthen the musculature.
So we do two things. So most of our physiotherapy sessions are once a week sessions and they go on for 4 to 6 weeks. They do a combination of manual therapy and exercises. So manual therapy is just using the hand. They may use some dry needling also, but we don't use any electrotherapy at all. As far as lumbar disc herniations are concerned, I really don't send them for physiotherapy. I send them for physiotherapy predominantly for back pain.
What is the role of yoga, Zumba, Pilates? I mean, that's yoga is especially people tend to ask a lot.
Yeah, yoga is a hot favorite in our country.
Yeah.
So they're basically, I think, static exercises to strengthen the muscles. Surya Namaskar is something that is strongly recommended by people. We don't have a randomized controlled trial comparing the two, I think.
No, there's already published which shows some benefit.
Benefit of yoga over physio, sir? Yoga over physio?
Now, Ranjit?
Yes, sir.
What do you think about yoga?
So definitely, if you go through the so-called protocols of physical therapy which we follow, that is core strengthening exercises. If you see, there are many asanas in yoga which actually do the same thing in a different name. So I strictly don't discourage that. I too, like Dr. Thomas said, I'm a big believer in physical therapy for acute low back and chronic low back pain. So they always ask, sir, I'm doing yoga, shall I continue? I told yes. Don't do any posture which is causing pain. If it is causing pain, don't do it, and stick with the other part of it, what you do.
Naresh does a lot of yoga himself. Naresh, what do you think about it?
So I personally believe yoga is very good. As Ranjit said, there are 2-3 issues in that. For someone who is going to start yoga after getting back pain, I think that is not the right time. Someone already used to yoga and he can continue doing the yoga, especially for, I've seen personally patients with disc prolapse who does this Bhujangasana, where there is extension of the back and they feel quite relaxed after this Bhujangasana. And Surya Namaskaras are very good for follow-up. I think there is a paper published on of yoga as a physical therapy in
the only reason I find
very good
is the fact that people will do yoga as a sense of health related for well-being, and they tend to carry it for a longer duration of time. And when you use the word physio, they think that it's a part of a treatment of yours, is a part of your medical management. Therefore, whenever they are okay to do it, I always motivate them. You either do yoga, if they are ladies, they can do Zumba or Pilates, some sort of exercises which helps to increase the core muscles and also helps to improve the flexibility of the back.
So there's one question related to this physio here, sir. What PNSP Prasad sir from Kamam. So he's asking, what is your comment on traction? Whether even if it doesn't have a long-term relief, it will hold the patient onto bed. Do you agree with this philosophy?
So there is no role for bed rest in the first place.
Sorry, Rakesh. Thomas, you are not.
Joined later on. We just have to. Basically, we do not advocate traction as such, even though it's going to make the patient lie down in the bed. We don't want the patient to lie down in the bed on the first scenario in a patient with a chronic, non-specific or a mechanical type of or a degenerative pain. We want them to be as ambulatory as possible. As such, all of us, we have discussed this earlier, we do not prefer to use traction as a mode of treatment.
So one more question regarding the same scenario. Subramania Rao sir is asking about ergonomics and lifestyle modifications.
Thomas?
I
mean, definitely those are long-term.
Surya Prakash, you can take it.
See, ergonomics and
lifestyle modification.
Sorry.
Ergonomics and lifestyle modification is probably really important. Actually, as Thomas was talking, I realized something. A lot of times, software employees, we have so many people coming even in Hyderabad for low back pain. Lot of thing what I've realized is they are the people who do night shifts. Basically, we understand the diurnal rhythm of hormones is completely screwed up. So basically, the corticosteroid, it is very high, in the evening, which is supposed to be low in the evening. So entire thing is topsy-turvy. So obviously, the endocrinological mayhem is there in the body. So I think lifestyle is really important to sleep properly, to do good exercise, to have good food. I think there is no second, to that. That is, of course, absolutely primary.
Can you just
And then
define to, I mean, we want to know what do you mean by ergonomics? And
yeah,
just give a
coming
quick
to
idea
ergonomics as such, most of the, see, we are not made to sit for say 7 to 10 hours every day. In fact, unfortunately, most of our jobs push us into a sitting sort of a job. Continuous sitting over a long period of time is probably absolutely not good. So first thing is that they have to frequently get up and move. Every 1 hour, they have to go walk, at least stand in one place, again sit down and keep moving. Two, at the workplace, especially when there are people sitting with the computers on in front of them, the computer should be ideally, the monitor should be at the eye level, and the elbows you should have almost only around 30 degrees of flexion at the elbow, 30 to 40 degrees of flexion at the elbow, and proper sort of a height of the table and height of the chair. All these constitute ergonomic situation. So a good probable ergonomic exercise, I mean ergonomic table setup, and it's also a good idea to switch over to a few hours in a day to go for a standing desks. And these are various things people can adopt in their daily life, especially at workplace, to keep moving and to keep their back in a more healthier situation than what it could be done.
Naresh, any other question?
No, no question, sir. And I just got one doubt about this one when Surya Prakash sir was talking. So this Corona season of lockdown for 3 weeks is going to increase back pains or reduce back pains?
Surya Prakash, what do you say?
I don't know. It is anybody's guess.
Yeah, sitting long is really bad. People are getting gaining weight, and most of them are actually sitting and watching TV. Yeah. I think this is the time where they do a little bit of exercise or do whatever they are used to for the back. Even for people who doesn't have back pain.
It is important they stand and walk around for quite duration of time so that the lumbar lordosis is achieved. It goes, you got a loss of lordosis, it goes into kyphosis. It's better to stand and walk around for some duration of time, every 1 to 2 hours, so that the proper posture is maintained.
So take one more question here now, sir, or you want to move forward? Yeah, there's one question on. So this is from Hani Hamid. So we don't advise bed rest even in patients with acute exacerbations of chronic low back pain. So we're saying the bed rest should be avoided. Should we avoid even in the acute pain? The one question on, is there any role on intravenous solumetrol for acute pain? There's the two questions which are not addressed in the previous.
We do not use solumetrol as such in acute pain. I'm sure that a lot of neurologists tend to use a lot of solumetrol, but we do not advocate the usage. There is no evidence to suggest that. That's number one. Number two, in a patient has got acute severe back pain, you can advise rest, but it should not be more than 2 days. After that, you should do some sort of activity to comfort. And that's very important. We have found that patients who are active, who tend to walk about a bit, are tend to likely to become better much earlier than patients who take a bed rest for a very long duration of time.
I think a small point has to be, people have to take home here is, rest is not given in the form of a prescription. Like if they are feeling so bad, they can rest a bit. But then the thing is that they should be made ambulatory as much as they can.
Yes.
I think the point should be like that.
Yeah, clear. Thank you. We'll move on to the next case. A 30-year-old patient who's got a low back pain with radiculopathy. SLR is positive, and there is some weakness in the foot, but power is normal, sensation is normal. But he says there is weakness in the foot, but when you examine, the power looks normal. Therefore, is there any, Ranjit, is there any tips for you to bring about subtle weakness when you do a neurological examination in these particular patients with low back pain and radiculopathy?
Yes, sir, very much. It's a very common misunderstood or overly diagnosed thing of weakness. Now, in this patient, 8 weeks of leg pain. So I'm thinking primarily in terms of radiculopathy. If he tells weakness, if you make him lie down and examine, you might miss For example, the best way to see for S1 weakness is asking the patient to walk on toes. You ask him to raise both heels, ask him to do a toe walking. If he cannot do this, or when he does it, he kind of buckles down, that means there is a definite S1 weakness. Same way to see for EHL or tibialis anterior weakness, you have to ask him to walk on dorsiflexed foot. You ask him to walk dorsiflexed foot. If he cannot take it up, there is L4 weakness. Same way, I trust a lot on the Trendelenburg test. If he cannot stand on one leg or he sways to other side, there is the Trendelenburg test can pick up grade 4 muscle power also. So I rely on these three things to decide my motor weakness than an examination just by supine and asking toe up and toe down.
Okay. Thomas, this is the MRI of this patient. He's got a left-sided L5S1 disc prolapse, and he has tried conservative treatment, no response, 8 weeks time. When you take the MRI, what do you advise? What type of MRI would you prefer? Is there anything you want to tell the audience that what type of MRI they need to take?
So you mean limited MRI versus screening of the whole spine?
Yes.
Okay. So what is ideal is that if you're getting an MRI scan done of one region, it is a good practice to screen the whole spine, because I think there is a study that came out from Ganga which showed a lot of this is the one. Yes, which showed a lot of other pathologies that can be picked up if you do a screening of the whole spine. So I think it is a good practice if you can screen the whole spine. Along with, so when you ask for an MRI in this condition, you ask for an MRI of the lumbosacral spine with screening of the whole spine.
It's not necessary like that, because if you take, one important thing, it's ideal to use 1.5 Tesla MRI. Number two, you can tell the radiologist, because whenever they do a scout MRI initially to do the counting. They just have to stitch it together and give us a print. It's not like a whole spine MRI. It's only a T2 mid-sag.
No, just a one single screening mid-sagittal view.
It gives a better idea of the overall pathology, as you can see in this. We did a study from our institute wherein 4.3% of the patient needed a surgical intervention, which was incidental finding what we noticed in a whole spine MRI. Therefore, we would advise, whenever you're taking a lumbar spine, they should provide you a T2 weighted mid-sag cut of the whole of spine. We are taking a cervical spine, along with cervical spine, one T2 weighted mid-sagittal image of the whole of spine. If you speak to the radiologist of wherever you're going to send, they'll definitely be able to do that. And that's very, very important. Therefore, in this patient, he's got no relief. What will he do? Ranjit.
He's a young male, 8 weeks of non-surgical treatment, still has persistent pain and subjective weakness, which is affecting his quality of life. My advice would be to think about surgery.
Okay, if you're doing surgery, what surgery we will do?
Sir, among those three, each have got plus and minuses. Today, I personally would think that this is a right patient for an endoscopic discectomy or a minimally invasive discectomy.
Okay. As I understand, it depends on what you are comfortable with. Definitely, with the improvement in technology, definitely endoscopic, a well-done endoscopic is really good. But still, the standard of care still remains the microdiscectomy.
It's a microdiscectomy. Yes, sir. So
maybe in another 5 years, endoscopic discectomy will become the standard of care.
Yes, sir. So it's very, very, very important to have the right message to the audience. There is no definite proof or evidence as of now that an endoscopic discectomy is better than a microdiscectomy. There is no evidence. There are RCTs published even last month, which says that an endoscopic discectomy is as good as a microdiscectomy. So
I think it should be reversed, Ranjit. Microdiscectomy is the gold standard. Endoscopy is come later. When you talk about endoscopy, are you talking about a midline endoscopy or a Young's technique? That is also really important.
Interlaminar endoscopy or transforaminal. This study which I am quoting has quoted both the techniques. So the gold standard is a microdiscectomy. it is like what sir said, a well done endoscopy. That is very important. A well done endoscopy is as good as a microdiscectomy. Still, the gold standard is a microdiscectomy.
Now, the important thing is that when you're doing a microdiscectomy or even an open discectomy, the common question that comes to people's mind is how much disc to remove. Surya Prakash, what is your practice? How much disc we should remove?
See, whatever disc has extruded out and it is pressing on the nerve is removed. That is clear. 2, I do an annulotomy. I do a rather wide annulotomy, put my instrument into the disc space, remove as many loose fragments as I find, and that's it.
Naresh, what's your practice?
So initially it all depends on the fragments, sir. If I am comfortable with the fragment which has shown on the MRI and what I get it out and the nerve root is free, then I don't want to go inside and dig it, but I'll just go inside and check for the loose fragments. I'm not a strong believer of just fragmentectomy and just don't go inside and check it, but I make an attempt just to see if there is any loose fragments, but not a aggressive discectomy.
Thomas and Ranjit, you both agree to this approach?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
My take is you remove the fragment in the canal to alleviate your symptoms. You remove the fragment in the disc space to decrease your recurrence. So you have to remove only the loose fragments in the disc space to decrease your recurrence rate and remove the fragment like Dr. Surya Prakash Rao mentioned to remove the symptoms.
Okay, coming to the next picture here, the picture above is a L45 disc. Picture below is a L5S1 disc. Therefore, what is the importance of these two pictures here? Is there any difference in apart from the disc prolapse at different levels, is there anything you notice?
Maybe a wrong level operation?
No, it's two different patients.
Okay.
One patient has got a L45 disc prolapse. Other patient has got a L5S1 disc prolapse. Apart from the disc, do you also look at something else in the end plate? You're looking at anything else you would like to look at, and does it have a significance?
Do you see a lot of modic changes in the L5S1 disc space?
In the lower level, yes.
Lower level.
What is the importance of it? Does it have an impact on your management?
The biggest problem is if we don't notice this before surgery and the patient comes back with recurrent symptoms, there is a very high chance that we confuse them with discitis. So it is very important to note it.
Okay. This is, I will come to it. The type 1 modic change is when in T1 images, the end plate, there is hypointense, and in T2, it becomes hyperintense. That is a type 1, which is a fibrovascular marrow, whereas type 2, it is hyperintense and hyperintense in both in T1 and T2, whereas type 3 is iso-intense in both T1 and T2. The importance lies in the fact there's a lot of articles which is coming now showing that the modic changes are there. There is the conservative treatment, they don't do that well because they are cartilaginous herniation. And we did a study which we completed now 1 year follow-up. Discectomy alone in modic change patients, the pain and functional outcome score was worse compared to non-modic patients. The patient satisfaction was worse, and the infection also was more in patients with modic changes. I mean, that's something new that is coming out. Therefore, for somebody who is looking at, you always look at the modic change, and especially the type 1 modic is what is important, which is hypointense in T1 and hyperintense in T2. Sometimes it can be mistaken for an infection also. And there is also a belief now it could be an evidence of early infection also. Naresh, what do they do in this situation? They got a lysis at L5, but there's a disc prolapse at L45.
So again, basically, go back to the symptoms, sir. Symptoms of the patient. If the patient presents with
any major low back pain, right now comes with low back pain with radiculopathy of 8 weeks duration.
Yeah.
Right-sided radiculopathy.
Yeah. So in this scenario, it's because there's a lysis at L5S1, so which is going to compress on the L5 root. Similarly, the 4-5 disc also going to compress on the L5 root. So very difficult to assess which is the main culprit. If the patient has got predominant back pain, so I tend to decompress 4-5 level and also fix at 5S1 at the same sitting.
Okay. Ranjit, what would be your approach would be?
Sir, in this patient, I would safely disregard the L5 lysis if there is no back pain, because we know that there is nearly 6 to 7% incidence of asymptomatic lysis in normal population. I will only treat the L4-5 disc, which is causing it, his right-sided leg pain, and I will tend not to fuse him because fusion might increase the, if I tend to fuse a 4-5-5, S1 might become symptomatic.
Yeah, the previous history of back pain is very, very important. If there is no previous history of back pain, only the symptom is related to radiculopathy and an MRI which shows a huge disc, extruded disc like that, I think my choice would be to do only a discectomy at L4-5 level. And the next case is a 56-year-old lady, low back pain with left radiculopathy. SLR is negative, but she complains of a lot of pain in the leg. And this is what the MRI shows. Thomas, what's your inference?
What's the duration of the symptoms, sir?
Duration is only for the last, I've not written, for the last, I mean, chronically there, but worsened for the last 3 months, 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. More of right-sided leg pain, severe pain, SLR is negative.
I don't know. I mean, there is a reasonable size disc herniation at L4-5, and if somebody comes with very severe pain like that, if it's anything else, the other thing that needs to be looked at is if there's any facetal cyst, because they also can cause very severe pain down the leg. But the other thing to look for is there seems to be a extraforaminal disc at that level. So that's something that cannot be missed. I think there is an extraforaminal disc.
Because it's very important, you always have to check the axial cut, T2 weighted images. Sometimes a lot of radiologists, a lot of these radiologist centers have got radiologists who are just past, joined, who doesn't have experience in reading a spine MRI. They tend not to report it. Therefore, if the patient is very symptomatic, sometimes even if SLR is negative, because it's outside, sometimes the SLR may not be positive, but there's severe pain, elderly individuals, they usually will be in the range of 45 to 60 years of age. Always look for an extraforaminal disc. I mean, that's very, very important. The patient has underwent a discectomy. He comes back after 3 weeks, mild leg and back pain, wound has not healed. Surya Prakash, what do you think it is? Do you think it's a chronic, discitis, infection? What will you do?
Usually discitis, unless it is a very vigorous and a purulent form which has really caused a wound dehiscence, this sort of a symptom is probably not discitis. It could be due to excessive retraction or whatever local soft tissue problems. I tend to go slow on this because the patient is got only a mild leg pain and a back pain. I think we just, if at all we are worried, if we have let some gauze piece or something inside, we can re-explore the patient, get an MRI just in case to check up. But otherwise, because the symptoms are not so severe, I tend to go a little bit more milder on this situation.
The important thing is how the patient comes to you. If the patient is coming walking quite comfortable and no major back pain, and you see there is a wound is not healed, you don't have to worry too much. It indicates that the wound is superficial. It can happen, like you mentioned, because of retraction. It can happen because of the subcutaneous stitch which you use, the Vicryl or a monocryl. Sometimes when it doesn't get absorbed, they tend to don't allow the wound to settle down. That's the most important thing. Therefore, when do you suspect discitis, Ranjit?
Sir, my index of suspicion is patient had a surgery, got better with leg and back pain, which comes after 2 or 3 weeks with severe back pain, more than leg pain, significant movement restriction, and especially night pain. These are my red flags which tell me that this is a possible patient who has developed a post-operative spondylolischitis.
Okay. Well, what investigation will you ask? Do you ask for lab?
Sir, in my practice, since we know that the CRP or ESR immediately has the one value has got no importance. It is routine for me to get a CRP done pre-operative as well as immediate post-operative, which I don't repeat it unless patient comes back with a significant back pain. I see a rising titer, then that is very, very suspicious of discitis, because it's published from your institute that up to 14th day we have got a rising CRP and then it starts falling. So the only way for me to suspect that is to have a baseline CRP.
Okay. But even then, the CRP is better than ESR because CRP comes down to the baseline within 4 to 5 days time. And then only if there is a second spike, when you see them at 2 to 3 weeks, you find that the CRP is elevated, it goes more in favor of an infection. What about this scenario? He comes at 3 weeks, the wound looks like this, doesn't look that good. He's got a lot of back pain. Surya Prakash, what will he do?
This looks like looks to me like a sort of diagnosed solid cautery burn all around the place. It looks like more like an eschar because it also wouldn't. It says it's mostly a local wound problem. That's what I feel.
He had a lot of pain. He's not able to walk.
Then probably we need to look at discitis as one of the possibilities in this case.
But this gentleman, this is the MRI showed superficial infection extending up to the deeper level. But fortunately, the disc space was not infected. Okay, but this is what the basic thing is. They come with a lot of back pain, which is out of proportion, and X-ray does not show anything. MRI usually will show a bright signal intensity in the level of the disc. There could be an abscess if it is epidural abscess, and severe axial pain, which is out of proportion to the physical findings. Any disc patient who comes around 2 to 3 weeks time or 3 to 4 weeks time, and usually most of them come between 5 to 25 days, around 3 to 4 weeks time. They are fine. As Ranjit mentioned, they're fine after surgery. For a short duration of time, leg pain goes off, comes with severe back pain, which is out of proportion. We should always suspect, irrespective of the imaging finding, you should always suspect that it is a discitis. Is there any particular preventive measures you adopt in your center nowadays to prevent infections? Naresh, what is your pre-operative prevention protocol?
The regular prophylactic antibiotics, sir. Cefazolin will give. And then intraoperatively.
For all your operative patients.
Yeah. Amikacin and cefazolin I will give for all operative patients. Intraoperatively, of late we are practicing this intraoperative antibiotic, local antibiotic, vancomycin for instrumented cases.
Yeah.
For uninstrumented disc prolapse cases and all, we don't try to use the saline. Instead, we try to use either gentamicin in the saline or use metrozil wash in a solution rather than using a regular. We try to minimize as much of saline contamination as possible operatively. And post-operative, yeah.
I just wanted to highlight because in our hospital, what we do is called a preventive care bundle. We have a pre-operative preventive care bundle wherein you ask the patient to have a chlorhexidine bath before the surgery, the night before and the next day morning. And intraoperative is time-specified antibiotic and chlorhexidine based skin preparation and a post-operative bundle. And we have in the last 6 years, infection rate has dramatically come down with monitoring and implementation of this bundled approach. And this is what is now being promoted worldwide. Okay, if you have a discitis, how do you choose to decide when to do conservative treatment or when to do surgical treatment? Thomas.
Yeah. There was one, yeah. So I'll take questions later, so you go carry on.
Yeah.
So I think, see, firstly, the diagnosis of, we need to make a clear-cut diagnosis of discitis And
yeah,
a lot of it depends on your clinical intuition. Because MRI scans may show post-operative changes which are very similar to discitis, and your blood parameters may be out of whack also. So a clinical suspicion is very, very important. So there are two options. There is a conservative and then there is a surgical. Conservative would be antibiotic. Surgical is either a washout or a fusion. So between the two, what I do is I go by the pain. If the pain is very mild, I try to put a needle in, take a aspirate, get a culture done, and try antibiotics. But if the pain is very severe, I offer them a surgery. And in this case, I do a fusion for them.
Okay. Ranjit, what's your approach? Early, around 3 to 4 weeks, no bony destruction.
3 to 4 weeks, when I suspect discitis, like what Dr. Thomas mentioned, because of clinical features, first, I definitely get an MRI done to know is there any presence of epidural abscess or not. Okay. If there's no epidural abscess, in a case with epidural abscess, I will go in very early. I will not sit on it. If there's no abscess, which is most common the case, I always try to get a tissue. So my first choice, I do a transfemoral endoscopy. That is the easiest way to get into the disc space. I try to get a tissue. In the same sitting, I wash it out. I don't fuse all of them because by 3 weeks, I'm not expecting any great bony destruction. It is just inflammatory edema and granulation, which I clear via the endoscope, and I get the tissue, send for culture. And mostly in these, when it is post-op discitis, we come to know what the organism is and give sensitive antibiotic. And I tell them that you will take at least 3 to 6 weeks to get kind of better. If they don't get better or the patient comes in with significant bony destruction, I primarily do a fusion for them.
Okay. Is there anything regarding the culture, like you asked for extended culture? Because a lot of time patients might have taken antibiotic elsewhere.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So we have, once I suspect post-op discitis, we send for the entire range right from the positive, negative anaerobes, tuberculosis, as well as fungus. And we try to get the bacteria cultures from the tissue. So you take the blood culture bottle and aspirate the tissue from the disc space and send it in the blood culture bottle, not in our normal swab. So that has got a higher chance of turning positive than sending via the fluid culture.
It actually is very, very important to remember that swab as a culture should not be used ideally. Either you take it and inject into a bottle, or you can inject into an empty sterile bottle. Swab as such, the contaminations are significantly higher. And it is always important when you're not sure that if a patient might have taken antibiotic, it's better to ask an extended culture or at least 5 days, because sometimes extended culture gives you the chances of organism developing quite higher. Surya Prakash, when will you offer surgery for these patients?
My threshold for surgery in discitis is fairly low. Generally, I tend to counsel them to take extended bed rest. I think in these last 20 plus years, I've got 4 or 5 patients, and all of them have done extremely well with bed rest. But then if the pain is so severe and if I am forced to operate, I would offer them a simple instrumented fusion with the iliac bone in between.
Okay.
Is there any difference that you get a patient of your own operated case and someone else operated case?
No, my threshold is same for both.
Okay. In a post-operative discitis, Naresh, would you prefer to get a CT scan done? I mean,
yeah. So if I'm not planning to operate, maybe there is a way to get a CT scan at the same time, CT guided aspiration to get a tissue. But mostly I tend not to take a CT scan, but I go with the X-ray destruction and MRI most of the times.
Yeah,
but there are reports which says that the destruction is more than 50%, then you need to fuse both the two end plates. It all depends on the severity. So for my patients, I'm quite sure about if it gets infected. I know my commensal organisms. So I start off with antibiotics and try to take that material and do that. But someone else patient comes in, so then I need to be a little cautious that whether the antibiotics, without getting many times, what material you send for culture, you don't get a proper isolated organism. So you end up in giving a broad spectrum treatment until you get an extended release comes in. So then you are in a fix that which organism it might be. So those cases, if the patient is not responding with broad spectrum, my threshold for surgery is very low. I tend to operate on these patients more because the pain is very bad.
Yeah, we also, I mean, basically we tend to address them quite early. If there is no bony destruction, you just do a debridement because the pain relief is better as one of these patients with the final end results where there is a good healing. Okay, basically, and there is a study which has shown that in a MRI, when there is a involvement of greater than 60% of the body, medical treatment tend to be unsuccessful. Therefore, the operative management indication is failure of conservative treatment. When you are not able to identify the organism, the tendency for you to operate or your chances of success with medical management comes down. If there is neurology, instability, and progressive kyphosis, because in a spontaneous fusion is very, very common in these patients. This is one of our patients where, because there was a bony destruction later on, we had to go in, stabilize, and do an interbody fusion. I mean, we tend to use cages quite freely, but the only requirement if you want to use cages is you have to be sure that you have removed most of the disc that is inside the disc space. If you are kept a bit of a disc, the part of the annulus outside, then the infection won't settle. Safest is to put interbody grafts if you are doing an interbody fusion, or you can just stabilize, take a proper tissue culture, debride, give antibiotics. Usually they settle down because the end result is usually the fusion.
So there's a question regarding the same thing, sir. If you are not used to endoscopy, how can you get a disc material for biopsy? What are the approach you use? You use
Thomas?
Transpedicular or something. It is Leela Prasad from Vizag.
Thomas, what's your approach?
There are two ways of doing it. One is you can use the same approach that you use to do a nerve root block, but go into the disc with a little larger needle.
That's what you do usually.
Yeah.
Naresh, that answer, because it's not advisable to go transpedicular. Because either you have to go, as Thomas says, is actually transforaminal, but you're not doing like a discectomy approach, which is about 8 centimeters from the midline. Here it's going like a nerve root, and then
the Campin strangle. The Campin strangle. You enter via the Campin strangle with the needle.
Yeah. Okay. The other important thing is we have to differentiate radiculopathy, which is a nerve root compression, from a lumbar canal stenosis, which is basically a central canal compression. This is a central stenosis, that this is a radicular compression, lateral recess stenosis. Therefore, Ranjit, we have a patient here, 63-year-old, failed conservative treatment, and significant stenosis at L4-5. Not much of stenosis in L5-S1. X-ray shows mild subtle listhesis at L4-5. What will you do for this patient if you are operating for a surgical management?
So from this, I understand her primary disability is claudication, meaning leg pain, and very minimal back pain. She has no demonstrable instability clinically or radiologic. So my choice of treatment in her is just decompression of the stenosis at L4-5 level.
I know you do a lot of tubular discectomy. What is your honest opinion, whether you think it's superior to an open decompression, a tubular decompression, or an open decompression, in terms of short term and in terms of long term?
Very good question, sir. In this particular when you ask about tubular discectomy versus tubular decompression stenosis, both have got see change in outcomes. For a discectomy, wherein generally I only have to operate on one side, there is no great difference between micro discectomy vis-a-vis tubular discectomy vis-a-vis endoscopic interlaminar discectomy. The local mobility is very minimal in an endoscopic discectomy. Whereas in this situation where I am dealing with a stenosis, bilateral, lateral recess, and a central stenosis, wherein majority of the symptoms is because of the flavum hypertrophy and bone, not because of disc. In these patients, a tubular decompression scores great ways over a microlumbar discectomy, because going to the opposite side is very easy with the tubular discectomy in these patients as compared to going bilateral open in case of a microlumbar discectomy. So in a stenosis, the answer to your question is that tubular decompression scores much better, whereas in a discectomy, it is not much different.
Okay. Therefore, yeah. When do you decide to fuse in a patient with stenosis? Surya Prakash, do you fuse any time, or when do you decide to fuse?
When there is significant lysis associated with stenosis, this particular case we can get away with decompression itself. But if there is significant movement, that is, on the flexion X-ray, it has moved forward, the L5, L4 has moved forward. In the extension X-ray, it has gone actually more than the neutral backward. That I would consider a significant instability.
Okay.
In such cases, I would fuse along with decompression.
Now, if there is no documentable instability on a dynamic radiograph, is there in certain situation of stenosis, you might still consider fusion as an option?
I think such a possibilities are extremely rare, unless if there is an iatrogenic accident where we created an iatrogenic instability while doing the decompression. Otherwise, I wouldn't really plan for a fixation or a fusion for a simple lumbar stenosis case.
Naresh, what is your any situation in a stenosis without instability you tend to fuse?
For a transitional segment above the transitional segment, so that is one segment which is a little worrying for me. The patient has got a fused lumbosacral segment, and there is a 4-5 stenosis. I tend to fuse those segments.
That's what I want to highlight. The fact is that when you have a transition segment, when you are intervening, you have to be extremely cautious. The chances of your failure of an uninstrumented fusion is relatively, slightly on the higher side when compared to a normal population. Sometimes in patients with significant stenosis, verticalized facet joint, here the facet joint is in coronal plane. If the facet joints are verticalized and they have significant deficits, it's better to fuse so that the chance of recovery is better rather than trying to do a decompression alone.
So there is a question about spinous process splitting can be used for this approach for this patient. So what are the results, long-term results of spinous process splitting in a stenosis like this?
See, spinous process splitting is just an approach into the spinal canal. You can use it in any scenario. You can use it for a stenosis. You can use it for a discectomy when you want to do a bilateral approach. It is just an approach. It's just that you split the spinous process so that once you do that, you can do the laminectomy quite much more liberally. And definitely it can be used. I mean, it is probably meant to be used for a stenosis patient, not ideal for a discectomy patient. It is ideal for a stable stenosis where there is no instability.
In fact, you can get a better approach than a tubular retractor in a spinous process splitting approach.
But the amount of damage is definitely slightly more than the tubular disc retractor. We can't deny that. But anyway, tubular retractor is basically technically more challenging. There is a skill level that is involved. There's a learning curve that is involved. Whereas a spinous process splitting, there's no major skill that you need to acquire additionally to do that procedure. That's where the learning curve wise, spinous process splitting is easier when compared to a tubular approach. Here there is one more patient who has got an instability, and for whom, as Surya Prakash said, that there's a documented instability, there is a more than grade 1 slip, significant stenosis, and this patient is preferable to do an interbody. Thomas, you prefer interbody in all these situations, or do you think intertransverse fusion or a posterolateral fusion is adequate?
I do a lot of intertransverse fusions, but I reserve them predominantly for my older patients who where the disc height is not significant. So where the disc height is less, and in older patients I tend to do posterolateral fusion. But if they're younger patients or if the disc height is very much, I tend to do interbody fusion. If I have to remove the pars or the facets for anything at all, then I prefer to do an interbody fusion.
Ranjit, in your practice, do you do posterolateral fusion?
So since I try and do most of this fusion minimally invasive, I do interbody in all. You cannot do a minimally invasive posterolateral fusion.
Yeah. Naresh, in your practice, do you do posterolateral fusion?
There are situations where I do posterolateral fusion. If I see very narrow disc space, like Thomas said, and there is a bone on bone, I just get away with doing posterolateral fusion. And especially if it in a multi-level case, say if there is one segment which is hypermobile and which needs to be fixed, and other segment is settled and there is mild aesthesis. So the lower level I put interbody, and upper level I just put posterolateral fusions. So hybrid kind of, not.
Because you also do the same thing in multi-level. You do interbody lower level and posterolateral in the upper level.
Usually, most of my interbody surgeries, interbody fusions are for lytic listhesis in younger individuals. In people who are older than 60 years, I tend to favor more of for a posterolateral fusion along with instrumentation, because I find most of the times in older people beyond 60 years of age, usually there is absolute placement of cage and migration of cage are really big issues. So I feel I'm much more safer doing a simple posterolateral fusion. And in most of those cases, the disc height is not that high. So I'm more for posterolateral fusion in these cases.
Therefore, the message is that when you are doing instrumentation for a degenerative spine, you have to fuse. That's number one. And number two, the fusion could be either a posterolateral fusion or interbody fusion, right? Because there are evidence to suggest that when you do an interbody fusion, the incidence of adjacent segment degeneration probably could be more because of a more rigid segment as against a posterolateral fusion.
In open surgeries.
Excuse me?
That's in open surgery. In an open posterolateral fusion compared to an open interbody fusion.
Yes. So this is the patient with back pain, instability type, right lower limb pain. And this is what the radiographs show. You have taken the dynamic radiographs. There is a L5S1 grade 1 lytic listhesis. What will be the approach? His symptoms have been there for 1 year. He says his activity is becoming less. What do you see in the APU X-ray which you should be slightly worried about? Ranjit?
Yes, sir. So this actually is a dangerous X-ray for me. Dangerous X-ray, dangerous patient, because 35 years old, young male, long-term back pain. If you look at the X-ray, there is dysplastic facets. There is multi-level LDD. You can see osteophytes at 3, 4, 4, 5, lytic listhesis at L5S1. So you will not be able to exactly establish where the pain generator is, or there are multiple pain generators. So it's a dangerous patient. I'll try not to operate him whatever possible, because this is a recipe for long-term back pain for this patient, whatever. And I will definitely have an MRI after this picture, because I try and want to know where are the pain generators. He'll have multiple pain generators, cannot be from one source of pain.
Okay. This is what is, this is one more patient. Okay, I'm just showing this thing. This is what the MRI looks like. There is a lytic listhesis. I think it's the same guy. The MRI is like this. Different patient, sorry. What will he do in this scenario? A lot of pain not subsiding with conservative treatment, limiting its activity. He says he cannot go to work, is relatively harder work. Surya Prakash, what will he do in this scenario?
I think if
What
I'm
is the role of
convinced,
conservative treatment in the patients with the lytic disease? Because in a lot of these patients, you see a lot of a 50-year-old patient who comes with a back pain, you get an X-ray done, there is a lysis there. What will you do in this scenario? Advise surgery moment you see them, or what is your trigger point?
these chaps would have had lysis for a long period of time. In fact, especially when we see these people in their 50s and their late 40s, it is obvious that these chaps have had this problem ever since they are 20 years of age or even younger. But at this stage, this has become symptomatic, probably because of the disc degeneration. And also, many a times, it is the L5 root which gets trapped under the non-union, which gives rise to these symptoms. So I think we must evaluate them in that regard, give them adequate conservative care, and then see how they respond.
What is conservative care you give in these patients?
When core stabilization exercises, if the back pain and spasm is severe, maybe brace for a few days, and then give them a lot of exercises, NSAIDs, and see how they cope up with the situation. Most of the times it is like an acute episode or an exacerbation which settles with time. So probably this particular, probably had we got an X-ray on him, say 6 months before he had symptoms, X-ray would have looked the same, or an MRI would have looked the same. So I would sort of exhaust all the options for conservative care, and then I feel that's the only way. That's the only significant pain generator. Then probably we can go ahead and do a fusion.
Thomas, what is your physiotherapy protocol for this patient? Rehabilitation.
Before I go to physiotherapy, for a lot of these patients where I'm not too sure of the pain generator, I take for the lytic lysis, I tend to give them a PARS block.
Okay.
So they will, if the PARS is the pain generator, they usually get off the table with no pain. It's not steroid, just local anesthetic.
Okay.
So that tells me where the pain's coming from.
Now, what is your protocol of rehabilitation?
So I don't decide on the physiotherapy protocol, sir. My physiotherapists do that. So based on the belief that they know more physiotherapy than I do.
Then when do you consider them for surgery?
You're asking me, sir?
Yeah.
So if the pain does not settle down with the non-operative measure, and I'm sure the pain is coming from, and the pain generator is that lytic disease, and this is for patients with back pain alone. If they have leg pain, I think I've got a lower threshold of for operating on them. But if they come only with back pain, I tend to treat them non-operatively first, number one, and that would be a combination of some pain medications and prolonged physiotherapy. So our physiotherapy protocol works, we do once a week sessions for 4 to 6 weeks. Ranjit, and the remaining 6 days of the week, they do exercises at home. And somewhere along the way, I give them a PARS block with local anesthetic alone. And if the pain settles down, I'm more confident that if push comes to shove, then surgery will benefit them.
Okay. Ranjit, what's your indication for surgery in this group of patients?
These patients, young male or middle-aged male with demonstrable instability at L5S1 with significant back pain, and I will look carefully at the axial images for the L4-5 facets. If they are not much damaged, I would advise surgery for them after they have failed physical therapy of at least 3 to 6 months. Back pain, I tend to fuse very, very late. At least 3 to 6 months of significant physical therapy, they understand that I am not treating their disease, I am just treating their disability. If they're very clear about that, then I advise fusion for them, sir.
But the difficult part, what I have experienced is that whatever physical therapy you tell these particular patients, I mean, most of them are not motivated enough to do it quite sincerely. Either they come back at a short duration of time saying, pain is so worse after exercises, I'm not able to do anything.
They are the ones who don't do better even after surgery.
Yeah. I think here I've got a point to make. See, we need to emphasize to the patient that the treatment cannot be unilateral. That is, I give treatment to the patient and they cannot get spontaneously better without some effort coming from themselves. It's like a simple thing that to make a clap, you have to have both the hands together. You cannot make a good clap with one hand. So there has to be equal effort from the patient to get better. They need to work hard from their side. Otherwise, it's a simply passively accepting some form of a treatment is not going to make them better. And as Ranjit rightly said, these are the patients who do poorly even with surgical intervention.
Because that's the most important point, is the fact that patients with chronic low back pain, the treatment, actually the majority of the treatment lies with the patient. First is to understand what is their problem. Second thing is to undergo a good rehabilitation protocol, keep a positive frame of mind, and to continue to work. One of the important red flag for me is a guy, or yellow flag for me is a guy who says that because of this pain, I have not worked for 6 months. What do you think, Naresh?
Yeah, that is it's something like he's asking, so you operate, I'll go for work.
Yeah, it's very, very unlikely. If there's not work,
very careful those guys. And then the patient who cries with the back pain, and the patient who says pain all the time. So you will learn it over a period of time after you burn something.
couple of.
The other thing is that people who are doing antibody fusion for the first few times, the concern they have is whether to use a banana cage, whether to use a bullet cage, or what do you think is better, or does it make a difference? Do you need to put a cage at all? Thomas?
So in a light ecclesis, I would err towards putting a cage because there is no stability at the back except the screws and rods. Between splits and a T-lip kind of a cage, my preference is for a T.
Like a bullet cage. Surya Prakash, what is your...
Because I get for a banana T-lip.
Okay, some disturbance.
As long as the end plates are prepared well and graft is placed adequately in front of the cage, which is the most important thing, the type of cage doesn't really matter. That is my opinion.
Go do just a bone graft inside the interbody space. And
I have done that in many of the patients who couldn't afford. In Nizam's practice almost 10-15 years back in government hospital, when all they could afford were 4 screws, we have done that and we got very good results. It's not that cage is mandatory. It's just that it's a fancy way of keeping a spacer in between so that you know where your graft is in relation to the cage and you look where to look for in terms of fusion.
Naresh, what do you think about it? I mean, do you think cage is always necessary or a interbody graft will suffice?
So intergardy graft in terms of a structural graft is fine, sir. But intergardy graft in terms of local bone grafts, I think I have some reservations for that. I had few cases where,
especially in a light ecclesis, number 1.
Yeah.
The light ecclesis at L5S1.
Yeah.
You may get away in a degenerative listhesis grade 1 at L4-5 just by putting in cancellous type of interbody graft, because they're basically inherently they are stable. And once you put instrumentation and put a lot of graft, they tend to fuse quite well. But in the light ecclesis, it's always safer to have a structural bone graft, which we are not able to get. Therefore, a cage is an easier option in that.
Yeah, cage always saves some kind of collapse and maintains the foramen. As if I can put a cage, I think this will be first choice.
From the posterior crest, we can get a nice tricortical structural graft.
Yeah, definitely you can get it, but it's technically more difficult than putting a cage inside, which is
ready-made one.
Local bone graft is quite.
Local bone graft in the facet. Yeah.
I think Naresh is about 8 o'clock. We'll finish it.
Yes, sir. Shall I take few questions?
Yeah, definitely yes. I mean, just to summary, history is important. Always to focus on the red flags, and always do a good investigation, history, examination. Then only come to a diagnosis. Don't be hurrious, because we think we are surgeons, but most of the time we are orthopedic physicians. Come to a diagnosis before you think of what to operate. Yes, Naresh, the questions.
The few questions about role of epidural steroid in case of lumbocanal stenosis. Steroid in stenosis, not for the disc prolapse. So do you, you suggest to have it, or?
No, definitely you can give it, provided the stenosis is not very, very severe. Number one, patient doesn't have a neurological deficit. It tends to relieve the acute duration, acute pain or acute symptomatology what the patient is experiencing. There is no proven 100% evidence, but at least in our practice, we have seen that a lot of patients do feel comfortable with a good epidural steroid, at least for a shorter duration of time. And a lot of time, this stenosis is exacerbations and remissions. Once they get over that acute symptom, they should be quite okay for a longer duration of time.
So someone wanted to know about postpartum back pain and what could be the reasons and how to deal with it.
Thomas?
So I think a lot of them do come with back pain postpartum, predominantly because during the time of delivery, there are a lot of hormones secreted, especially relaxin, that tends to relax the ligaments around the pelvis for the pelvis to open up. So the treatment for that is predominantly physiotherapy based.
So I see a lot of patients. I think a few series of patients postpartum pain, but their pain is very classical. So they point their pain onto the buttock, and then they cup it to the groin. So those are the cases which are very specific of sacroiliac pains, because as Thomas said, this relaxin hormone tends to relax the pelvis, and the main relaxation happens at the sacroiliac joint. Actually, that will be very unbearable pain for them. They can't turn at the sides, they can't feed the baby. In those cases, the SI joint injection really works in those patients, and they will teach them some pelvic floor exercises and use the belt.
Other important thing is that a lot of time you tend to mistake it as an infection. Exactly. If you see the CRP you do, because in the immediate postpartum period, it will be slightly raised. MRI shows some sort of edema in the joint because there is a opening of the SI joint. And a lot of time this thing is usually mistaken as an infection and treated with antibiotics. But basically it's a self-limiting condition. As Naresh said, it's basically a SI joint pain. Sometimes it's very symptomatic. You can give local steroid. Using a pelvic binder will help them. And over a period of time, they settle down in 2 or 3 weeks' time. Be sure a vitamin D levels are okay. You replace it. It's not going to cure it, but it makes them symptomatically better.
Yeah, there is one question on technique of annulotomy by Dr. Amarnath. So is it better to give cruciate incision or circular annulotomy?
Surya Prakash, your
I think it doesn't really matter, because the incision should be adequate enough to pass a 3 or a 4 size ronger into the disc space. So it for me, I think I've done both, but I really don't find any one part better than the other.
Usually when you see carefully, usually that the inferior part of the disc, usually there will be a rent. You can make out a rent and you just have to enter through the rent. Only in younger patients, sometimes you may tend to make a round block-like annulotomy. Otherwise, a cruciate annulotomy all could be adequate in most of the patients, whenever the extruded disc fragment comes out quite easily.
I think that
what's your take on
contained discs, most of the times they need a kind of annulotomy.
Yes, I agree to that.
And then they are the ones who recur also, maximum.
And that's why you tend to remove more disc in those patients.
So there one more question regarding anybody experience on spinal PRP injections for disc prolapse?
Sorry, I have not given it.
No.
Ranjit, any?
No, sir. No experience.
See, basically, I mean, there is nothing wrong in trying it, but it's better to try something which is been proved to some extent. PRP, along with that, you give NSAIDs, maybe it may be a placebo, and we think that if some patients become better, it's because of PRP. It's the natural course of the disc prolapse, they tend to become better, and there's no proven advantage of giving PRP into the disc space as such.
So there is a question from Dr. Durga Prasad. He wants to know whether this stress X-ray is necessary for every case which we are going to operate. Are there any specific indications to get a stress X-ray?
What's your take?
Yeah. So when that patient is coming for surgical patient, there is no back pain at all. I'm only planning a discectomy, I don't get a stress X-ray done. Where I am not very sure that is the patient having, like what we said earlier, they're not very sure, what like Thomas said, where the pain exactly is coming from, where it is back or buttock or leg. I always get a stress X-ray to get it done to not to miss any subtle instability which I'm likely to miss if I don't do it. All patients know I don't get it. When in doubt, I get it done. All fusion patients definitely I get it done.
When you are deciding, when in doubt whether to fuse or not to fuse, it's always better to get it done. But if you are purely doing spine practice, I think it's better always to include that so that you don't tend not to miss
anything
particular time.
So I have a different philosophy on this, sir. If you are not fusing, I always get dynamic X-ray. If you are fusing,
maybe that's a better approach. Because you are not going to miss anybody who might have an instability. We take it in all our patients so that, because when we are seeing lot number of patients, we don't want to miss anything. Therefore, as a standard protocol, we tend to do for all operative patients. But I agree with Ranjit that, or Naresh, you can choose one of the philosophies.
There is a question regarding, is there any situation where gabapentin is better than pregabalin when it conservatively treating the low back pain?
It depends, like any NSAIDs. I think that certain people are sensitive to particular NSAIDs. Same way certain people are sensitive to pregabalin. Somebody is sensitive to gabapentin. But a word of caution, be very careful when you use that in elderly individuals. Sometimes it causes significant drowsiness. They may have an electrolyte imbalance the next day, or sometimes they may fall. Number two, it is absolutely contraindicated in patients with glaucoma. You have to remember that, because that's again is a big issue. There is a legal case which happened, I think, in some part of India.
Yeah, glaucoma is one of the contraindications. You need to be very careful.
Because as orthopedic surgeons, we don't, and you have to be, other thing you have to be careful is that some of the preparations, they are mentioned to be prescribed only by neurologists. You have to be very careful when you use these drugs. You make it a habit to leave through the leaflet once and see what's written there. Because there are big issues sometimes. The company will sell the product to us, we write the product, but in their leaflet it will be written to be prescribed by rheumatologist, to be prescribed by neurologist. You have to be careful about that. The issue happened once with the leflunomide.
Yes.
Actually, it is written there to be prescribed by rheumatologist. An orthopedic surgeon wrote, and he had a big issue with complications.
Yeah, there is a question to Ranjit. Ranjit, when do you prefer endoscopy discectomy over micro discectomy from Leela Prasad?
So when I see any patient who needs a discectomy, I first think, can I do it endoscopic? In which I decide transforaminal versus interlaminar based upon two factors. Number one, how high is the iliac crest? Number two, what is the disc location with respect to the disc space? If there's a high iliac crest like in L5S1, or there is a migrated disc, I go for interlaminar endoscopy. If not, I go for transforaminal endoscopy. When both these things, if there's significant calcification.
Hello, all right, so I have a little bit of explaining to do before this video. First of all, this video took so long to make, and I mean so long. Here's why. On the 23rd of February, I got a tweet at Steppy. I just bought your fiber jig, lol. I hope it's you, the real you. Also, side note, but random.
Who's this? Someone's
and then deleting it in hopes to be in a video. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure this is still up. I have no idea. Yeah, same thing with the fiber scans. I think they get down just because it's a scam.
Yeah, I think it's time for us to...
I was like, wait, what? I don't have a fiber jig? So I was confused, and I replied, it's not. And then he basically said he got scammed, and he spent $8 for no reason. I looked on the screenshot, and it said, hey, can we record now as I don't have a lot of time? And then the fake guy who pretended to be me was scamming me. No, we do it later.
Hacker Zoom.
And then,
Zoom timed out.
Scammed, and that was that. So on the 23rd of February, and I really just can't do much about this. Just don't believe people when they
Bye bye guys.
Now,
Okay,
fast
sir.
forward.
guys.
Thank you very much.
Right,
Another
bye.
person trying to pretend like it's me on Fiverr. This one's really funny too.
Yeah,
'cause
so
it
we
says
should
they're
next
from
time
the
we should have a
United
longer
Kingdom,
time.
which, if you can tell from my voice, I'm not.
Thank you, sir.
But all
Thank you
right,
very
okay.
much.
Thank
So
you, thank
obviously, this is a scam. A new person trying to.
Thanks,
scam people
Naresh.
to
Bye.
me. And I am only doing this because it's for a video. I decided to buy it, like the idiot
Bye,
I am.
Thomas.
I really just wanted to see what would happen. I mean, it's kind of an experiment. It's kind
Has
of
it been
not.
hacked?
So I decided
Yeah,
to buy
Has it been
somebody is
hacked?
hacking
it.
a lot.
Pretty much exactly what I
Has it
thought
been
would
hacked?
Yeah.
Or see, has been hacked.
package.
I don't know.
Like, you know,
I think so.
and so the bank responded almost like immediately and said, "Hey, I have been recording a lot of videos recently, so I haven't got around to playing with my fan. If you give me a few days, then I should be able to fit you into my
I think it's a
schedule."
Zoom
And I
advertisement.
simply replied, "Okay, but I paid.
No.
Aren't you supposed to meet the
No, I don't
deadline?"
think so.
And then get this: if you were a real fan, then you would realize I need to make videos. Hang on.
Cut down anyway, Naresh. Bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye,
Thank
bye,
you,
Ranjit.
Naresh.
Bye, Naresh.
Until I make time for you. So I
Bye,
said,
sir.
"Okay."
Bye-bye.
Subramanian Rao. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you for
Thank you, sir.
your
To play with you, you know.
nice interactive lecture.
When are
Bye,
you
sir.
ready?